materials of the Jewish Community Relations Council and learn how they have historically handled hate mail and why we would want to preserve these hate-filled documents in the archives. Okay.
Hello. I want to make sure you can hear me. Everything's okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Alan, yes. Okay. Thank you. All right, so I will share my screen and begin. And you can see my slides. We're good to go.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Hello from Des Moines, Iowa. I am so sorry not to be there in person with you all. I am down here presenting at the Midwest Archives Conference. It's a great conference. I'm missing the pizza though. Thank you for letting me zoom in to give my presentation. The theme this year for our First Fridays presentations has been correspondence in the archives. Back in July of last year, I chose this topic for my presentation, focusing on hate mail in the records of Jewish Community Relations Council. What, of course, I could not foresee was that global events would change my appetite for talking about anti-Semitism. This topic is not merely historical, but very present. The Anti-Defamation League has noted a nearly 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents across the United States since the fall. I don't know what I necessarily had planned when I chose this topic nearly a year ago, but undoubtedly it would have been a different presentation. So let me prepare you for what I've chosen to focus on today. I will not be speaking on the current climate on campus. As always, my goal is to showcase materials in the archives, but also be informative and entertaining. So I'm still going to talk about hate mail. What might one do when you get hate mail? What are the laws around hate mail? And what does the Jewish Community Relations Council do with hate mail? Finally, why would we want to keep these materials in the archives? Hate crimes, and therefore hate mail, targets a myriad of minorities, from Blacks and Jews to the LGBT community, to Muslims, to people with disabilities. Since this presentation is uplifting materials from the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives, I will be focusing my lens on hate mail that affects the Jewish community. Absolutely, amongst all of this anti-Semitic drivel, you can also find racist and sometimes homophobic materials. At times, even hate itself can be inclusive. But I will be focusing on the anti-Semitic stuff. I will not be showing any explicit hate mail. There will be some redacted images of hate mail, but that's it. I won't be sharing racist and anti-Semitic contents or words or images. It's there in the archives, lots of it, and it can be overwhelming and sad and numbing as you leaf through it all. It's horrifying and devastating and stupid and hilarious. And it's here being protected down in our caverns, available to researchers. So let's dive in. First, I want to go through a few definitions of terms, as well as discuss the law. Hate crimes are simply crimes, but with the added bias of hate, either real or perceived. Hate crimes are overt acts that can include acts of violence against persons or property, violation or deprivation of civil rights, or acts of intimidation. Hate crimes are more than just offensive speech or offensive conduct. It is a specific criminal behavior. In terms of the mail, using mail to do harm to an organization or individual is against the law. But there's a difference between a threatening letter and hate mail. A threatening letter, according to the United States Postal Inspection Service, is a letter that threatens a person's reputation, blackmail, or extortion, and this is a federal crime. Hate mail that uses negative or hostile, hurtful language targeting a person or group based on bias. If that letter doesn't contain certain threats, it's not a crime. So according to US Code 876 on mailing threatening communications, There is only a violation if there is, quote, communication addressed to any other person containing a threat to kidnap the person or a threat to injure the person of the addressee or another. So hateful words themselves going through the post is not a crime. A crime is a crime. That differentiation is important, at least in the eyes of the Postal Service. So what does one do when they find themselves on the receiving end of this vitriol? Through graffiti on your building, through slurs or bullying or jokes, or as it relates to our theme, through the mail. If you are a member of the Jewish communities of the Twin Cities, chances are you are going to turn to Jewish Community Relations Council. When issues arise that impact the Jewish communities of Minnesota, the voice that has spoken up consistently for nearly 100 years has been that of the Jewish Community Relations Council, alternatively known as the Anti-Defamation Council of Minnesota and the Minnesota Jewish Council. This group was first established in the late 1930s as a reaction to rising anti-Semitism in the Twin Cities. At that time, the fascist group, the Silver Shirts, was gaining membership and modeling themselves after Nazi Germany's brown shirts. Their sentiments fed an atmosphere of discrimination against Jews that bled into housing and employment discrimination. Jewish community members took notice and established a group to investigate and combat hate. Jewish Community Relations Council, headed initially by Samuel Shiner, would collect and review reports of anti-Semitic incidents, working with government leaders, schools, and businesses to combat discrimination. Through boycott threats, letter writing campaigns, publicity, and public and private negotiations, the Jewish Community Relations Council consistently advocated on behalf of the rights of the Jewish community. But even in those early years, a foundation of their work was information gathering and documentation. As people approached JCRC to tell their stories around anti-Semitic events, reports were kept to track incidents. What happened? Who was involved? Where did it happen? All of what is left behind, as found in our 120 plus box collection documenting the work of JCRC, is this detailed history of the discrimination Jewish Minnesotans encountered over the decades. What started as these typewritten reports, then notes on 3x5 cards, has now morphed into a practice of weekly email blasts detailing security incident issues and incidents. So if something happened in the community, swastika graffiti on a synagogue, hate mail coming to your home, anti-Semitic flyers found in public spaces, racist bullying, JCRC has tracked it and then attempted to counter such discrimination through education and partnership building. And in the world before social media became the hotbed for anonymous hate, the post box is where some Jewish community members found these instances of intimidation and hate. So let us all remember, before the technologies we so rely upon, like text messages, email, social media platforms, in decades past, along with the then still somewhat new telephone, mail through the United States Post Office was one of the key methods of communication. Back then, addresses were identifying information that was public, found in things like city directories, and even mentioned in newspaper articles as a way to identify a person. Where someone lived was freely public information, and therefore so was your ability to send them mail. Unfortunately, not everyone had well intentions as they sent things through the post. A large chunk of hate mail to be found in the records of JCRC comes from the 1980s, and so I'm going to focus on that decade. The 1980s are a great decade to focus on because in my mind, I think like, oh, it's not that long ago. Kate, that's 40 years ago. This is ancient history, particularly to the youths. But it's also not that ancient, right? Sometimes when people think of anti-Semitism, particularly our younger students, they think, oh, well, that ended in the 1950s after the Holocaust. It's clearly not true. Anti-Semitism is alive and well. And the 1980s, with, among other things, the rise in neo-Nazi culture, Certainly, that decade saw its share of hate. It's also an era where mail was still the predominant media where information was exchanged. Right before the explosion of the digital age moved hate to areas like chat rooms, and then eventually Facebook and Twitter. Combing through the 120 plus boxes of Jewish Community Relations Council materials, you find all sorts of hate literature that was sent to various people through the post. So what do they send? All sorts of material. Envelopes stuffed with pamphlets that are nationally published or self-published, typewritten, handwritten. There's short personal notes of generic hate. There are long diatribes in which the reader, and potentially the writer, loses the plot. There are cartoons, again, both nationally created and locally drawn. All of them traffic in hate and stereotypes about Jewish people. They sometimes threaten the person with harm, tell the person to shut their mouths, sometimes wish death upon that person or upon all Jews. All of this is meant to intimidate in an effort to silence that person for whatever harm they are perceived to have done. Sometimes it is simply their mere existence as a Jew that appears to be the reason. So it's one thing to see hate flyers posted in a public space. That certainly happened. One example I found in this time in JCRC's papers was when flyers were posted at a grocery store up in St. Cloud in the 1980s, blaming the abduction of Jacob Wetterling on, quote, Jewish ritual murder, an old anti-Semitic standby. That's hard enough to witness in a public space, of course, but when it comes to your home, a sense of privacy has been invaded. This spiteful sender knows where you live. Questions of personal safety come into question. Some people certainly may have merely thrown the offending material out, but some turn to JCRC to figure out what to do next. So who gets hate mail? Here are examples of two typical community members who reached out to JCRC. The first is addressed to Mort, which is Morton Ryweck, who is then the executive director of JCRC. Quote, enclosed is a letter that came to our home. Would be interested whether this is a complete mailing or if we were singled out. Thanks, sincerely, Esther Kapp. Esther Kapp was a much celebrated philanthropist in the Jewish community in St. Paul. She wondered if this was run-of-the-mill hate, or if sadly she was somehow targeted by this enclosed hate. The next one, which is signed illegibly, simply states, sorry to be sending this trash to you, but I don't know what else to do with it. The sender was undoubtedly confused and hurt and turned to JCRC for guidance on next steps. Some people received hate mail after taking public stances. Here we see Associate Professor of Law Carol Chomsky, who in 1989 reached out to Mort, stating, quote, I recently received in the mail a set of anti-Semitic clippings, which I believe was sent to me in response to a letter to the editor from me, which was printed in last week's Star Tribune, as well as in the Pioneer Press a few days earlier. At the suggestion of my colleague, I am sending for your files a copy of the clippings and of the envelope. Not just people were targeted, of course. Synagogues and general Jewish organizations were targeted too. Here we have the St. Paul Jewish Community Center reaching out, quote, enclosed for your information is a mailing we received JCC, including in the envelope the anti-Semitic letter in question. Synagogues and Jewish organizations are clearly and publicly Jewish, and while they take hate mail seriously, it is also clear that they, unfortunately, take it in stride as routine and not as personally as if it were to come to your home. JCRC also has strong ties with non-Jewish organizations, including those in the Christian community. Here we see Calvary Baptist Church minister Wes Forsline writing in 1981, quote, Dear Morton, last week I received this enclosure in an unmarked envelope mailed February 9th from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm sure you've seen much of this scurrilous material, but I thought I'd just pass it on as another example of someone's incredible fear and hate. Keep up the good work, my friends. Mort writes back, yes, I am familiar with this tripe as it has been very widely distributed. It covers just about every anti-Semitic argument imaginable. Perhaps the sender was hoping to find a willing audience for their hate at this Baptist church, but luckily did not find it. One of the more interesting letters surrounding hate mail came from the offices of Dear Abby in 1992. This letter was first sent to the Anti-Defamation League in Los Angeles. Quote, Dear Janet, as we discussed today, enclosed are anti-Semitic and racist material which were recently sent to Dear Abby, columnist. These materials are an outrage and very inaccurate. You will note on the enclosed return envelope that it is supposedly from American Education International or something like that. Whatever it is, it's obviously a conservative right-wing group whose tactics are to inflame. Are you familiar with this group? If you can, we would appreciate you letting us know who this group is. Thank you. So how does this relate to Minnesota? We find out in the next letter. From JCRC to the Anti-Defamation League in Los Angeles. Thank you for sending the materials. The handwriting on the envelope is the same as our samples. As I mentioned, the address is of a major St. Paul synagogue. Some of the material is familiar. So it turns out at a certain point around this time, someone was sending anti-Semitic hate mail to people and then listing the return address of Jewish organizations and Jewish community members. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. The hate mail Dear Abby received was probably due to some advice that she doled out in a column. What the sender may or may not have known was that Dear Abby herself was born Pauline Friedman to Russian Jewish immigrants living in the upper Midwest. Clearly, people, once they've received hate mail, are turning to JCRC for guidance, leadership, and next steps. So what can JCRC do to stop this harassment? A first potential ally appears to be the postmaster at the post office. Here we have a 1981 letter from JCRC to the postmaster in Minneapolis. Dear Sir, the attached vicious anti-Semitic statements and drawings were mysteriously written on this B'nai B'rith renewals dues invoice after it was sent to the incorrect address. It therefore seems that either someone at 1104 South 8th Street or someone working at the post office may have scrawled these anti-Semitic statements. I trust you will conduct an investigation and let us know the results. At first, I thought, wow, we're potentially pointing the blame at the postal workers? That's pretty bold. But then he continues. I recall that about 2 years ago, local Nazi party leader Steve Martinson was working at the post office, and we had at that time complaints of swastika drawings in the men's bathroom. If he's still working there, or any of his cohorts, they would be a prime suspect for such a flagrant act. Mort also reaches out to the Office of the Inspector Charge in St. Paul. Quote, enclosed is the original B'nai B'rith membership renewal envelope, which was opened by someone, KKK statements scrawled and literature enclosed, and then returned to the sender because it went to the incorrect address. The postal inspector who replies, noting that the event and surmising that the people who lived at that location have received mail addressed in many names, and therefore they were potentially the culprits. The inspector closes, however, stating, quote, there's no violation of postal law and additional attention by the Postal Inspection Service is not contemplated. And it's true, if we remember US Code 876, mailing threatening communications, there is only a violation if there is communication addressed containing a threat to kidnap any person or threatening to injure the person of the addressee or another. Another letter to Chief Inspector from 1986 reiterates this fact. Quote, this will acknowledge your complaint relative to the receipt of objectionable mail. As information, scurrilous, libelous, or defamatory matter, including that of a derogatory nature, constitutes a violation of postal statutes when such writings are contained on postcards or on the outside of an envelope or wrapper. For more information on this topic, I hope you caught Aidan Bateen's presentation last month from the Tretter Collection, or maybe you've seen the exhibit across the hall. These statutes were used to censor queer materials. He goes on, quote, "It is unfortunate that the mails are being used in this manner. However, examination of the mail disclosed no apparent violation of postal laws. Since state or local laws may apply in this situation, you may wish to contact a law enforcement agency in the locality where the mailing originated." Year after year, JCRC seems to attempt to work with the postal work inspector. 1987, we see another letter. "Dear Mr. McCusick, last year we met to discuss the spate of hate literature and letters, frequently of a threatening nature, sent to members of the Jewish community who have sent letters to the editor, to our major newspapers, or otherwise have appeared in the news. Now it appears that that same person is stepping up his campaign, but with a new twist. He now puts either phony or real Jewish names and addresses as a return address on the envelopes. This fraud would seem to be a flagrant violation of the law. Fraudulently sending out hate and or threatening mail in the name of other persons would seem to be a definite violation of law. Can we meet to discuss how to proceed on this?" He then goes on to CC other people, including the sergeant of the Minneapolis Police Department and the FBI director. Our reply to this letter comes in a "while you were out" message. Postal Inspector Haggard called. The message that was taken notes, quote, "He said, suspect they had for another anonymous letter was Lutheran Scandinavian who dealt with his abhorrence of intermarriage and race mixing and did not take stock in letters to Horowitz and others." Horowitz is Sam Horowitz, who was one of the people who was used in those phony return addresses. I love this message because it seems to simply state, ignore the guy. The following year, it appears there's a new postal inspector, so they try again to meet with him. Quote, "This fraudulent situation seems to be getting out of control. We would therefore like to meet with you and some of the other law enforcement officials to pool our information in this situation and determine the best way to proceed to catch the culprit." Again, the post office seems unwilling to invest too much time in this. After all, on their end, according to their rules, no law is being broken. And so JCRC pivots to attempt to work with the local police departments. JCRC has, over the years, attempted to work with police on various issues with varying degrees of success. One example, here in 1981, we see JCRC reach out to the Minneapolis Police Street Crime Division, noting, quote, "The city has been flooded in recent weeks with copies of the enclosed anti-Semitic hate flyers. Distributing such flyers anonymously is a violation of city law, which requires identification and a return address." The police and JCRC would work together to try to find handwriting matches or fingerprints to track down the offenders. Mort, returning these to you, no identifiable prints. When, in 1987, the Minneapolis Police Department noted that they were going to start a project to, among other things, record, classify, and provide a statistical database of bias-motivated crimes, they reached out to JCRC as a partner. JCRC writes back, quote, "You are to be commended for setting up within the police department a bias crimes recording system and training for police to use such a procedure, investigate such acts, and help meet the special needs of the victims. Although fortunately, these crimes do not occur on a daily basis, they have a pervasive impact on the community because they are generally directed against a particular racial, religious, or ethnic group. Even though an individual may be the target of the attack or threat, the perpetrator generally is trying to intimidate the minority group to which that individual belongs through a swastika smearing on a Jewish institution or cross burning or arson attempt at a Black home or Black institution. So the community consequences of these acts go far beyond the specific episode. Our agency has had a great deal of experience in objectively evaluating bias crimes and in generating a community climate to counter them. The enclosures will attest to this. The actual details of how these two groups work together on this project are lost. They're not kept among the archives. I have no further details on how or if hate mail was curbed by any meaningful way at this time, but my answer may also lie in the hate mail files that continue in the decades and decades after. But this letter really encapsulates what JCRC was attempting to fight for. When someone was a target of such hate, JCRC provided leadership, working with other local organizations, providing education to the community around acts of hate and anti-Semitism, and simply a place for understanding and empathy as Jewish community members felt unsafe and targeted by hate mail. One final piece I want to touch upon in my talk is a bit more meta. So while I chose to not show you the actual words of hate, believe me, they're in the collection, and it is intense. So why, as the person who is in charge of this collection, why do I keep these materials of hate? Do I give it weight somehow by keeping it? Do I elevate it or validate its merit by choosing to keep it for posterity in perpetuity? Contrary to popular belief, archivists love to throw things out. I have happily deaccessioned materials often. I could, as the curator, work with the donor and discuss getting rid of the hate mail itself. Because as you saw, I was still able to tell this story without showcasing the actual offending material. I have the back and forth correspondence, JCRC writing to the postmaster, the police, community leaders, discussing that they received the hate mail. Do I need to keep the hate? But then where do I draw that line? If I get rid of the hate mail, do I get rid of the hate flyers, the hate pamphlets, the hate chat room printouts, the hate graffiti posters? Ultimately, I don't think that deletion is correct. Throwing out the hate mail doesn't make the collection better. It doesn't solve anti-Semitism either. Researchers can and do use these collections. They research the threads of anti-Semitism across decades, investigating tropes and tactics that are used generation after generation, and oftentimes, surprisingly, not surprising or new. You can learn a lot by looking through materials of hate. You learn how people display their hate, and in turn, perhaps how to dismantle or combat it. JCRC spent years gathering evidence of anti-Semitism. Hate mail itself illustrates a lived reality for some Jewish community members. Finally, I want to note that originally I was going to give this presentation back in December before I got the flu and had to postpone my presentation. I had chosen that time because an exhibit that I had curated was on display. Symbolic Significance, Tracing the History of Jewish High Holidays and the First Day of School, was mounted on the third floor of Anderson and is documented yet another wing of JCRC's work, which was advocating for students in times where the first day of school clashed with Jewish high holidays. Unfortunately, that exhibit is no longer on display in the building, though I hope many of you had the opportunity to see it while it was up. The final panel of that exhibit was titled, Who Cares? Why Care? I once again bring that up. Why do we care about hate mail? Hate mail in the decades before Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, X, brought hate into the safety of people's homes. Perhaps now people have become so desensitized by the incessant hateful online comments and a volatile political landscape, but hate mail was and is scary. Intimidation in the mail, or even anonymous flyering, which we still see today, can lead to a culture of intimidation and isolation, and even signal the potential for actualized future violence. Racist and anti-Semitic bullying should never be tolerated in any form, past or present. In 1989, JCRC gave testimony on hate crimes legislation. Morton Rieweck noted, quote, "Hate crimes demand a specific response from the community because of their multiplying and pervasive impact. They affect the targeted group emotionally and psychologically. They have an intimidating effect, making members of the target group feel vulnerable and fearful and unprotected by law. Such ugly incidents also fuel ethnic and racial tensions, undermining the cohesiveness of the community. Sometimes correspondence in the archives is not so nice, but it is our duty in the archives to collect and document history, even the parts of it that are ugly." Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. And while Monica gets us switched over, I will introduce our second presentation, which is Thank You for Your Contributions, presented by Tim Johnson, curator of the Sherlock Holmes collections. 2024 marks the 50th anniversary of the Sherlock Holmes collections, a collection of collections developed over the years by many contributions from members of the Sherlockian community. This presentation will explore some of the letters that paint a picture of how the Holmes collections grew over the last 5 decades.
First of all, I want to give a shout out to Monica and all the other tech people who make all of this possible month in and month out. Monica, thank you for your wizardry. And the other thing that I want to do before beginning, because the title of my position with the Holmes collection is the E.W. McDermott, curator of the Sherlock Holmes collection. And today there are 2 very special people in the audience that I want to acknowledge. Mac McDermott's daughters, Anne and Mary, if you would stand. It's good to have you both here. Sherlockians are also in the habit of starting out their presentations with a quote from the canon. So let me give you one from the Reigate Squire. "It is of the highest importance in the art of detection to be able to recognize out of a number of facts which are incidental and which are vital. Otherwise, your energy and attention must be dissipated instead of being concentrated." I better move that closer so I can. So one vital fact that concentrates our attention in the case of the Sherlock Holmes collection is the curious occurrence of the Norwegian explorers. It is almost a certainty that nothing which followed would have been possible were it not for a 1947 lunch at the campus club. Here on an April midday, 5 prominent faculty members, all with a shared Sherlockian interest, decided to form a science society of the New York-based Baker Street Irregulars. They called themselves the Norwegian Explorers of Minnesota, and launched their expeditions in 1948 and continue to be an active agent in the Sherlockian world and a valued partner of the Sherlock Holmes collections. I'm also going to stretch the definition of correspondence here a little bit. And not everybody who I will be talking about is necessarily represented in the correspondence, but I want to introduce you to some of the actors in this little drama. On the university side are the faculty members who had that lunch. Wallace Armstrong and Bryce Crawford from chemistry, Elmer William Zebarth, AKA Easy to his friends, from speech communications, Theodore Blagan, historian and dean of the graduate school for 20 years from 1940 to 1960, and E.W. Mac McDermott, university librarian. And Mac occupied other positions as well at the university. On the collector's side, we have James Ziraldi of New York City, who was on the staff, I believe, of the Pier Hotel in Manhattan, most likely as a house musician. He remains a bit of a mystery man. Then we have Dr. Philip Showalter Hench, chief rheumatologist at the Mayo Clinic, and his wife, Mary Kaler Hench, and you'll meet Mary again shortly. Among Dr. Hench's many degrees and honors is the 1950 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, which he shared with Dr. Kendall and Dr. Reichstein. Dr. Hench also held a Master of Science degree from the University of Minnesota and was an energetic member of the Norwegian explorers until his passing while on vacation in Jamaica in 1965 from pneumonia. And finally, we have John Bennett Shaw of Santa Fe, New Mexico, builder of the largest collection in the world related to homes, known by many as the Johnny Appleseed of the Sherlockian world, an entrepreneur, a Notre Dame graduate, and beloved by many who met him. On the library side, we have Austin McLean, curator, and John Jensen, assistant curator of the library's Special Collections and Rare Books unit. McLean and Jensen joined the library together in the mid-1960s and retired on the same day in 1995, a noteworthy span of 28 years. And here we might add McDermott as well, by this time volunteering his services in the unit. And then a library school student by the name of Andrew Malik, who contributed much to the collections. Now to the correspondence and other communications. The first one, interestingly, was written 50 years ago yesterday, May 2nd, 1974. It came from Austin McLean, a little announcement. Through a gift from the McKnight Foundation, the University of Minnesota Library has been able to acquire the interesting collection of Sherlockiana collected by Mr. James C. Ziraldi of New York. In addition to early editions of the adventures, the collection includes numerous memorabilia, photographs, clippings, etc. The collection will be available for display to members of the Norwegian explorers, which causes me to ask, was it going to be on display for anybody else? I think so. 18 months later, in the autumn of 1975, John Bennett Shaw was invited to deliver a department-sponsored lecture at the university. Shaw's address, which you can actually listen to online at the University Library's UMedia site, was titled "The Cult of Sherlock Holmes." And he provided an upper Midwest audience with a panoramic description of the Holmesian landscape. Now, toward the end of his presentation, Shaw made some library-related observations. I should mention the collections. You have here in your university library the McDermott collection of Holmes material, which is quite good. I have what is probably the largest of all research collections, with 10 or 12,000 Holmes items. I have a room that was built just to house my collection, and I must report that it's almost full. And I don't know what I'm going to do. One might imagine a number of bibliographic ears perked up on hearing this last little remark. And it's not too difficult to imagine that an idea came into being that might bring Shaw's collection to Minnesota. Meanwhile, the remarkable Philip Hench collection was given to the university in 1978 by Hench's widow, Mary. In the late summer and early fall of 1979, the universities celebrated the acquisitions by means of an exhibit. Andrew Malik, that energetic library school graduate student, created the catalog and introduced the world to the collection. In it, he wrote, Dr. Hensch's interest in the Reichenbach project stimulated his collecting enterprise. And I should pause and say the Reichenbach project was a trip that they took in 1953, Mary and Philip, to the Reichenbach Falls and the village of Meiringen, at which they discovered nobody in the village had ever heard of Sherlock Holmes. So what are they going to do about it? That's a whole other story. Though Hensch had assembled Doyle Publications through the years, the bulk of the collection was acquired in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It consists of approximately 1,800 books, 1,500 issues of various periodicals, photographs, illustrations, manuscripts, and various sorts of memorabilia. The collection relates preponderantly to Sherlock Holmes, but Doyle's other works, particularly his non-Sherlockian fiction, are also well represented. And I should just note that the print here is one of many that the Hensches collected. They bought prints of the Reichenbach Falls from a number of dealers, and this is just a little detail from one of those prints. In the catalog, Andrew Malik then also continued, it was a notable achievement for Dr. Hensch to assemble such a distinguished collection in such a short time, but he did not build it alone. Mrs. Hensch was an active participant as she gave her husband many of the most important items in the collection as gifts. And I should also note, this was the second collection the Hensches built together. The first one, which is at the University of Virginia, deals with yellow fever. The Hensch collection drew numerous other gifts to the university, or to use a cosmic image, it was the Big Bang which created the Sherlockian universe in Minneapolis. In 1982, Bryce Crawford from chemistry wrote to McDermott about the future of the Shaw collection. Quote, the points raised by John Bennett Shaw do indeed catch my interest and perhaps even excitement. I believe that our follow-up should be reasonably prompt. By that, I don't mean we should fall all over ourselves, but that we should proceed to indicate to John that the possible ultimate marriage of his collection with ours is very appealing to us, and that we would like to explore this possibility further. To this end, I think it is rather important that someone toddle down to New Mexico to spend a day with John. I love that, toddle down, and to discuss possibilities and potential and appropriate provision of a program which would lead comfortably to this end. Bryce goes on, to me, the object now is to present to Shaw the idea as persuasively and convincingly as possible that his valuable and beloved collection would indeed be well placed with us, that it would be looked after by a responsible institution with knowledgeable and responsible officers in charge of such special collections, and that the net result would be the formation of the unquestioned first and greatest collection of its kind in an institution where it would receive proper care with appropriate access provided for scholarly work. Austin McLean did make that trip towards the end of the year, and it paid dividends. In a post-Christmas note, John Bennett Shaw said, quote, I lean even more to Minnesota for eventual depository for the collection, but am boggled as to how to do it, appraisal, terms, and so on. By the time of the Sherlockian birthday festivities, which is the Baker Street gathering in New York City in January of 1983, Shaw was busy talking to anyone with the expertise on how to make the thing happen. On his return from New York, Shaw reported, quote, I have spent much time thinking and talking about the possible future at Minnesota for my beloved library. I have talked about the matter some with Mr. Hollier at the Toronto Library, with my longtime friend and tax advisor, and with my lawyer. So I am serious about the matter. What I want, and you must help formalize this idea, is that after my death, the University of Minnesota takes possession of the entire Holmes collection. Shaw also shared a tantalizing encounter. Before I go on, let me recount a most interesting talk I had. I lunched with Edith Meiser, who has the wonderful bunch of things she did for radio, scripts, discs, and so on. She ran into a problem with giving it to an isolated Western university as a tax break. I suggested that she sell it to Minnesota. Then she stunned me by saying she felt her obligation, her collection, should go when mine went, and to the same place. Now here McLean and McDermott follow up, and this time it's with an official within the university, Dr. Willard Thompson, who was the director of the summer session at the university. And Mack and Austin wrote this in a memo. Our negotiations for the Shaw collection have been agreeably complicated by the prospect of acquiring yet another important Sherlock Holmes collection. Edith Meiser, though known mainly for her acting career, also wrote the radio scripts for the Sherlock Holmes stories that began to be broadcast in the 1930s. The Meiser collection is being sought by private collectors and institutions, but Miss Meiser insists that her collection shall go to the institution that acquires the Shaw collection. On Valentine's Day, 1983, John Bennett Shaw signed a joint purchase and gift agreement with the university. His collection had a new home. That following July, and in conjunction with the summer session office, Shaw and Meiser were on campus talking about her radio career. And in a live portrayal, which was part of the events, in the form of a simulated radio drama, Dave Moore and Don Shelby, both from WCCO, performed. A few years later, as promised, Edith Meiser's collection came to Minnesota. Now, let me mention a few other milestones before my time runs out, and I'm really just covering the first half of the history of the collection. Somebody else will write the second half. And these are in the form of some conferences, exhibits, and publications, which are also main vehicles for promoting and growing the Holmes collection, a little different than correspondence. September 1984 saw the conference, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in Minnesota, sponsored by the Norwegian Explorers, the Minneapolis Public Library, the St. Paul Public Library, the university, and the library's Department of Special Collections and Rare Books. The conference featured over 24 speakers. And once again, John Bennett Shaw was a participant, this time joined by his wife, Dorothy. 1985 saw Holmes venturing throughout the upper Midwest in a traveling exhibition, Investigating Sherlock Holmes, organized by the touring exhibition program of the University of Minnesota's Art Museum and funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Lindell King, director of the Art Museum, which we know now as the Weizmann, and members of her staff were instrumental in making the exhibit a reality. According to the final report sent to the NEH, Investigating Sherlock Holmes traveled from May 1985 to December 1988, a total of 18 sites reaching over almost 64,000 visitors. The final report to NEH also noted some significant gains for the collections, including material from the son and daughter of illustrator Frederick Dorr Steele, who donated their father's artwork, quote, because they were impressed with the visibility the materials would receive here. Along with another major collection, the holdings of the late Vincent Sterrett, the preeminent American Sherlockian scholar from Chicago. Now, Sterrett's collection arrived in 1988, although the relationship between Sterrett and Minnesota goes back to at least the founding of the Norwegian explorers in 1948. In April of 1948, Sterrett wrote to Dr. Stanley Pargelis, president at the Newberry Library, quote, "Last February, you wrote me about a Minneapolis chapter of the Baker Street Irregulars, the Norwegian explorers, who wanted us to visit them and speak to them. I didn't reply because A, I was too busy, and B, I didn't see how under the sun I could get up to Minneapolis anyway. This is still my fix, but your letter has been lying around reproaching me for weeks. Please thank McDermott and express my regrets, if you will." As with Sterrett himself, there was some question of whether his collection would ever come to the Twin Cities. More than a little convincing an argument was applied to library administrators before the purchase was approved. Austin McLean, as part of his lobbying of the library and administration, informed the head of the collection division that a Boston dealer was acting as agent in the sale and was, quote, "offering it to us first because we have the leading Sherlockian resources in America." I don't know whether people in Chicago know about the availability of the Sterrett collection, but I expect that the Newberry, University of Chicago, or some other place would snap it up. This is an extremely important collection for Minnesota. We must get it somehow. Administrative responses were not encouraging. One administrator wrote, "It is fair to say that none of us is enthusiastic about it. I have several basic problems with the proposal. There is purely the tactical matter of paying for such a collection. More fundamentally than these tactical issues, however, I simply do not see the importance of this collection for the university libraries. I would encourage you instead to turn your collection development attention to other, more programmatically central areas." Now, McLean pounded on and fought on with more memos, and at one point, the heat of his argument affected his typing skills. And it's littered with typos, and no doubt provided a challenging read or amusement to his administrative target. In the end, however, library administrators conceded the point. Quote, "We may be able to do it." The library and papers of Sterrett were purchased with the help of John E. Andrus III Charitable Trust. The acquisition of the Howard Haycraft collection in 1992 encompasses nearly the entire history and development of the Sherlock Holmes collections and predates the purchase of the Araldi collection. Haycraft, a 1928 graduate of the university and author of the classics Murder for Pleasure and The Art of the Detective Story, informed university librarian Ned Stanford in early 1971 of his, quote, "interest in exploring arrangements to place my collection of mystery and detective fiction in a university library where it would be properly housed and used for study and research in the future." Stanford, who was about to go on leave, turned the matter over to McLean in special collections. Austin corresponded with Haycraft within weeks and suggested a visit in New York City. By March, McLean was thanking Haycraft for the wonderful visit, the lunch at the Players Club, and a chance to view the collection. At the same time, McLean offered several helpful suggestions to Haycraft on how a will or other formal agreement might be written as it pertained to the donation of the collection. Within another 2 weeks, Haycraft responded with, "Many thanks for your prompt and helpful letter, a copy of which I have sent to our attorney for guidance in drawing my new will." Haycraft died in November 91, and the following August, the university's Office of General Counsel communicated the terms of the will to Austin McLean and the library. Besides the books, periodicals, and papers in the Haycraft collection, the bequest included $2,000 for the preservation and maintenance of that collection. And here I want to end by looking at two remarkable letters from the Haycraft collection, and you'll recognize the letter writer, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. December 27th, 1940. Dear Howard, thank you so much for your annual Christmas letter, which I always enjoy receiving. I'm glad you enjoyed the Anderson concert. She really has a beautiful voice. Marian Anderson. I shall be interested to see your new book, and I congratulate you on all your successes, of which Hick has told me. With every good wish for the new year, I am sincerely yours, Eleanor Roosevelt. And then this letter, written exactly 80 years ago today, May 3rd, 1944. Dear Howard, I'm very glad to hear from Hick that you have been promoted to major and also that you are now in New York. That must be very pleasant because you can go to the country over weekends. It is nice for Hick because you will always be there when she goes up, and that will add to her joy, though she does not seem to need anything to add to her joy in her house. With best wishes to you both, I am very sincerely yours, Eleanor Roosevelt. So that's a bare bones history of the first half of the collection, but we keep adding. And I just want to point out a major acquisition that is now coming to us, the papers of Laurie R. King, a well-known author, part of the Mystery Writers of America. We're very excited about her papers coming. Also, to make you aware of the conference this summer, the end of July, the last weekend, Sherlock Holmes at 50, celebrating the golden anniversary of the Sherlock Holmes collections. So thank you for a chance to blabber on a little bit about Mr. Holmes. I'll also note that just this morning, before I started, I got some more for the collection. So
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, audience. Just a reminder, if you are interested in a tour, connect with Amanda and Andy, who are in the back of the room. And we currently have 4 exhibits in the building. So please visit Dear Community, Mail Correspondence and Postal Activism in LGBTQ History. That is in the first floor gallery. The Global Reach of Local Activism, Minnesota Human Rights Stories. That's in the second floor balcony in the elevators at the back of the building. Gray Wolf at 50, First Drafts and Next Pages, is on the ground floor inside the Wallen Center, and also on the ground floor in the James Ford Bell Room, Curious Strangers, which will give you a chance to look at depictions of people on maps. And thanks again for attending this season, and we hope that you will join us again in October. Thank you.